Notorious gang boss Ernest Solomon is being buried this morning. Solomon was shot dead while driving in Boksburg last month.
Yes, the funeral service is over, but right now in the Tusong Hall, what is taking place is a traditional Khoi ritual. So members that were part of Ernest Solomon's clan, they are now basically paying tribute to him. We heard from Solomon's son, Vito, a touching tribute to his father, speaking about the type of man that his father was, speaking about the fact that his father had tried to protect his family to the...
To me, my father was nothing more than my father, because he was always a father first. There's nothing bad I can say about him besides the fact that he was very strict on all of us. We had it tough growing up with always having to be careful of where you go and what you do, looking out, looking over your shoulder, but he always looked out for us and tended to us first. So he was big on family. Yeah, my father was a great guy.
Welcome back to my channel, and thank you very much for joining me here again today. So last week we spoke about the shoelace strangler and how he was arrested, sent to prison, but got out before even half of his sentence was served. And when he got out, he went on to do the unthinkable. So if you haven't seen that, I will link that up here for you. But today we are going to talk about something that is quite rife in Cape Town, but very well hidden. And I do say well hidden quite lightly because it is well hidden for those who do not live in certain areas, but for people who do live in these areas, it is an ongoing, constant, daily occurrence to experience. But today we're going to talk about a very notorious gang boss who was gunned down here in Cape Town, South Africa. So thank you very much for this suggestion. And I have been wanting to cover more gang-related crimes here on this channel, but I do think that the gangs are quite complex, and it is very evident here in this case because one person does not just command other people to do something. Everyone has a finger in the pie in some way, shape, or form. And if one person does something, it kind of has this domino effect on the rest of the gang or people who are involved. But with that being said, let's get into today's case.
Intended for mature audiences only.
Cape Town is one of the most deceptive cities in the world. For those who live in areas such as Newlands, St. James, Tamboerskloof, Clifton, the list goes on. It is stunning and full of beautiful scenery. Being able to walk through gardens and see the lush vegetation, or taking a walk up jammy steps at the University of Cape Town, watching the sunset is a luxury and a privilege. But when we take a tiny little look deeper into the heart of Cape Town, we have this beauty. But then we go home to our high walls, burglar bar protected windows, where we would never walk alone at night, where we have this constant feeling of uncertainty and fear, especially when we hear the knock in the middle of the night. We know that Cape Town is one of the most violent places in the world, and there's this paradox where it is an incredibly beautiful city, but it has one of the highest murder rates in the world, amongst other crimes. We know that our problems in Cape Town are not unique, and we can't deny that the exasperated anger that was made prevalent during the apartheid era has had an outlasting effect on our citizens. However, drugs, alcohol, extreme high crime, and lack of infrastructure and jobs are contributing factors too. South Africans are tough, hardworking, and incredibly resilient. However, people do need to put food on the table, and people will do what they need to do in order to survive. Now, with that all being said, I was reading up a bit about the history of gangs in South Africa, particularly in Cape Town. And for a lot of us in the city, they are gangs right on our doorstep. They play a key role in many of our criminal activities that happen in the country, but they are very well hidden in many aspects. But the history of the gang started just after the Second World War, and the area about where most documentation was about where it started was in the area of District 6. District 6 was most commonly occupied by people of color at the time. There was apparently a large boom in the population after the Second World War, or the baby boom. And because of the amount of people started to get bored, people started to look for something to do, and there were younger kids or teenagers who looked for something to do and became a little bit naughty. But in order to counter this and to try and stop crime from happening in the area of District 6, a group called the Globe Gang then started. And the Globe Gang really started to try and help fight crime, to try and help police solve petty crime that was happening in the area. And they were really kind of a vigilante group. There was nothing really established at that time. But one thing led to another, and organized crime then started coming out of the Globe Gang. And instead of helping the police, they then started hiding things from police, and that's how things started to escalate. Eventually, the Globe Gang became corrupt and began doing illegal activities, such as running protection rackets, and then this extended to ex-prisoners, where eventually one thing led to another, and young men were carrying guns for no reason. The young men then started doing initiations, which involved rape, and they would also then get tattoos on their body to signify which gang they were from or affiliated to. And some initiations also instructed the members to murder. But I'm not saying this is the only way that gangs started. This is just how it was documented in some articles. But it is an interesting bit of information, or little tidbit of information, of how the branches then of these gangs then spread out all across Cape Town and South Africa as a whole, and how this little vigilante group may have now spread to cause the devastation that they do today. But with that being said, and that little backstory, let's really get started on this case. So the case we're going to talk about today is the assassination of former 28 gang boss Ernest Solomon. Ernest Solomon was a major part of the 28th gang back in the 1990s, and the 28th gang in Cape Town are known for their violence, and according to an article, they are quite well known for sexual violence. It is also alleged that they are quite the sexual offenders, and they either force each other within their gang to have sex with each other, and they do believe in same-sex relationships within the group. However, an interesting little fact about the 28th gang coming out of Pollsmoor prison in South Africa is that the 28s within the Pollsmoor system keep things quite fair and quite organized, especially in the kitchen. So they make sure that every inmate gets their fair share of food, and they make sure that everything is fair and equal. And if you have ever seen the episode of Ross Kemp on gangs here in South Africa or in Cape Town, here they do talk about the numbers gangs, and they give a little bit of information on each number. So the numbers gangs are like the 26s, the 27s, and the 28s. But if you haven't seen that documentary, I'll link it down below for interest.
As I watch prisoners arrive, I notice some are heavily tattooed. Chris informs me that they're members of the number gang, old hands returning to Pollsmoor. Their amateur tattoos are carved in with razors and blackened with ink. Gangsters are marked men for life.
So Ernest Solomon was known as the Godfather or Al Capone of the 28s back in the 90s. He had a very weighty reputation. He was also nicknamed Ernie the Terrible when he was younger. Later on in Ernest's career, he lived in a place just outside of Cape Town city centre, and apparently Ernest, who worked in the gangs, was a very different person to who he was when he went home at night. Ernest was apparently very caring, very loving, and very helpful to those who he was very close-knit with, especially his immediate family members. Apparently, Ernest had 25 children and 25 grandchildren, but I only ever read this in one article, so I can't confirm. But with the 28's reputation of how violent they were, he apparently did incredibly brutal and horrific things during his time in the 28s, but I guess that comes part and parcel of being in the gang life. Later on, Ernest would try and fix what he had done. He did release a video explaining why joining gangs is incredibly dangerous, it is really bad, and people should really try and avoid it the best they could. And during the past 10 years or so, Ernest has been really dedicated in trying to help the communities and to try and help and make sure teenagers or children don't become involved in gang life. And he was very focused on the Cape Flats area itself to try and make sure they don't get involved. But when Ernest was assassinated, he was actually still part of a gang. So yes, he left the 28s back in the day, but he was now part of a new gang. And they were called the Terrible Josters or Terrible Josters. I'm probably pronouncing that very incorrectly. But this gang is based in Delft, and they are around 10,000 strong. But apparently, according to police, this specific gang focuses in areas such as Delft, Kleinmond, Westbank, and Ulysses River. And this specific gang that Ernest was involved in his later years was quite well known for taking out gang boss leaders or gang heads of the notorious gangs within Cape Town, especially their rival gangs, and specifically members from the 28th gang. They were also involved in money laundering, illegal firearms possessions, kidnapping and trafficking in all forms. and of course, murder. So do I think that it is a coincidence that Ernest Solomon, who left the 28s as an ex-gang boss, is now involved in a gang that takes out heads of rival gangs? I think not. But even though Ernest tried to step away from the gang life, he was involved in gangs until the end. And Ernest Solomons was in the 28s gang for around 37 years. And before Ernest Solomon's passing, like I said earlier, he did release a video trying to help the youth. And he said in his video, quote, "The number is like a germ. It comes into you when you are in prison. We all got it in us. I also got the germ in me. People die every day because of the story of the number. This cut in my face, I got because of the number. I was very young. I didn't know what the number really means to me. Now I must try to make it right for the people or my next generation before I'm not in this world anymore. I'm 54 years old. And all the years of my life I was losing friends, and those friends were like my brothers and like my children. When they died, I felt it in my heart, but I never thought of the day when I'm going to die." End quote. And it is quite sad that he released this video a couple of years before he passed, and especially when we talk about the way that he would pass further on in the story. But a couple of months before Ernest Solomon's murder, him and one of his sons were apparently in an area called Horston, and Horston is a small fishing village near Hermanus in Cape Town. And apparently, while Ernest and one of his sons were here, Ernest was shot in the stomach 5 times. And the reason that he was attacked here in Horston was apparently because he was stepping on rivals' turf. And there was kind of this altercation with regards to who actually owned the abalone poaching rights within this area. And with abalone poaching here, or palamon as we say it locally, it is very devastating to the environment. Taking these animals out of the sea and then illegally selling it to the Asian markets overseas is rife here in Cape Town. But with regards to Ernest being shot, there was another rival gang who was doing the same thing at the same time, and that is why this altercation occurred. Ernest was taken to the hospital, and this another attempt on his life, he survived. Now, we can't deny that there were many attempts on trying to kill Ernest Solomons, but Ernest being shot 5 times was probably one of the most important, leading up to what happened in November of 2020. On the 20th of November 2020, Ernest, his daughter, who was 25 at the time, and his daughter's daughter, who was 1 year old, were driving in their BMW. There were reports that there was another 15-year-old boy in the car, but this was according to some sources only. So the 4 of them were driving in Ernest's BMW, which apparently was bulletproof except for the roof of the vehicle. Allegedly, Ernest was on his way to drop off his daughter and his granddaughter, when all of a sudden a bakkie then rear-ended them, and then another bakkie came in the front of the car to block them from driving on. Ernest's daughter then tried to get out of the car door, but the car door would not open, and while she was trying to do this, the bakkie that was in front of them, all of its doors opened with men rushing out with guns pointed straight at them. One of the men then threw a smoke bomb under the car and it exploded, sending off a loud bang and scaring Ernest's daughter into making sure the door was closed. The men then came running out of all the vehicles and surrounded the car on either side, before they then opened fire all around the car. Realizing that the car was bulletproof, one man then ran up onto the bonnet of the car and fired many rounds into the roof. Ernest's daughter then said, quote, "The man who shot me looked at me in my face and shot me. I saw the 2 shots in my father's neck. I tried opening the door and getting out, but I shouted at my dad to drive because the attackers threw some kind of smoke bomb at us. My dad continued to drive and his last words were, 'Is this not a trap?' And then he was shot." End quote. Now, Ernest's last words for clarification were actually in Afrikaans, but I just translated them quickly. But according to police, Ernest was being stalked for weeks, and why police didn't give him a heads up or why there was not some kind of protection, I'm not quite sure. Maybe they don't do that. But he was being stalked for weeks, so this was a planned hit. This case is still unsolved, and it doesn't seem like it's going to be solved anytime soon. But with Ernest's death, it also means that a lot of crimes that he committed would also be unsolved, allegedly. Also, allegedly, Ernest was involved in quite high-profile murders, and because of what Ernest and a lot of other people in his gang did at the time, apparently, this had a domino effect on the violence between the 28s and other gangs now, even to this day. and now with Ernest's death means that many families will go with their loved ones' murders unsolved. And with a lot of articles that I was reading, a lot of people seem to think that a lot of gang activity or the communities where gangs preside is that gangsterism is almost preordained. But according to a study at the University of Cape Town, one of the professors said, quote, "I believe the path to gangsterism for many adolescents stems from a variety of mental health issues, coupled with an impoverished upbringing in dysfunctional families. What seemed to be happening was that these youngsters committed murders or rape in response to wanting to join a gang, or because they came from a background of abuse or neglect. Almost all of them came from families where violence was an everyday phenomenon. The conclusion I came to was the youngsters were not committing crimes because of some sort of abnormal criminal streak, but because of the circumstances that they were brought up in." End quote. So this is a very hectic case and quite deeply rooted in us as a society of South Africa. As a side note, everyone else in the car apparently survived, and apparently the young boy who was 15 years old sheltered the young 1-year-old, and he was the one who got shot. The 1-year-old was still injured, but they all did survive, except for Ernest. But let me know what you think of this case down below. I think gangs are incredibly complex and it's not something we can just cover right here. Let me know if you want me to go in a complete deep dive about gangs, specifically the numbers gangs. I do think that what the professor said about gangsterism is somewhat true. I do think that some teenagers are from very broken homes who do join the gang. But there are also a lot of teenagers, a lot of kids who come from broken homes who do not resort to the type of violence that gangs show or gangs live by, allegedly. This case was slightly different to what we really cover, but still very much murder and true crime. Ernest Solomon was a very big gang leader back in the time, and his effect of what he did back in the 1990s continues to have a domino effect on what happens today in the gangs here in Cape Town. Obviously, leaders will come and go, and there will always be someone new in the gang, but like we said earlier, orders do not always just come from the top. Everyone has a piece to play or a role to play within the gang. And sadly, in order to survive, some kids would have to take that route within the area they are in. Maybe they don't see any way out. Maybe they need that protection of the gangs for some reason or another. But let me stop babbling. Let me know what you think of this case down below. Thank you for everything, and I'll see you again next week. Bye.